Final speaker from the platform tonight is Lindsey. Many of you will know her as convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Lindsey.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming. The speakers tonight, we've had an incredibly varied panel of speakers who've covered, I think, lots and lots of the different issues that we're concerned about when we talk about the connections between Woolwich and the war on terror. And I want to just start with the fact that when we started the Stop the War Coalition 12 years ago now, we always had a big Muslim involvement because we always knew, and that one of the demands that we had from the very beginning was that the war on terror would lead to an increase in terrorism, but also a racist backlash against the Muslim community. And as previous speakers have said, this is a backlash which has become worse. If you look at what it was like in 2001, it was bad in some areas, but it was contained. If you look at 2005, when we had 7/7, again, an appalling level of deaths on the tube and on the buses here in central London, but there wasn't the same level of Islamophobia. And now we have a greater threat, not just in this country, but across Europe, the United States, and in many parts of the world. And I think the first thing we need to ask is why, when this was predicted by so many people, has nothing been done to deal with the question? Of course, the reason nothing has been done is because it challenges the whole narrative of our government, of other governments, as to what this war on terror is all about. And therefore, when you say, when you see the people who carried out the murder of Lee Rigby, you look at the situation, they very clearly say, we are doing this because of the wars in foreign countries. We're sorry that people are having to see us covered in blood and all this sort of things, but this is what women and children see every day in Afghanistan and Iraq and all these other places. Now, it is so obviously about the war when you hear these sorts of statements, but it's not just this one that is so obviously about the war. If you think of 7/7 itself, which is always portrayed as somehow coming out of nowhere, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was during the G8 summit, which was taking place in Scotland. It was 2 months after Tony Blair had just been re-elected in the general election of 2005. It was clearly motivated by political considerations. Now, people will say, well, you can't justify anyone doing this just by political considerations, and that's absolutely true. Most people who oppose the wars around the world don't do these kind of things, and there are particular reasons why individuals are led to do these kind of things. But as Joe Glenton said, this is not to justify it, but it is to explain it. It is to explain that people are more and more concerned by what is going on, and they're more and more concerned when we have a government which is, they turn around after this happens and they say explicitly this has nothing to do with foreign policy. What a lie that is from William Hague. It has everything to do with British foreign policy, with US foreign policy, and to deny this link, it seems to me, then means you have to put this in terms, as Tony Blair has done, you have to put it in terms either of pure evil, that somehow there are evil people in the world. Well, there are probably many evil people in the world, many of them allowing wars to carry out, many of them, like Tony Blair himself, encouraging wars in any country that he can possibly do so. But actually, it is not an explanation. Or, as Blair then says, well, it's a combination of evil and this particular evil religion called Islam, which we used to think that all religions had their extremists. But now we know that really it's only Islam that has those types of extremists who carry out these kind of killings. Now, this is, again, a massive lie perpetrated by people who are war criminals, who should have been brought to justice for the crimes that they committed over Afghanistan and particularly over Iraq, and who are now trying to justify their own past actions and future actions that they want to carry out. And it's quite incredible when you look particularly at Blair, who defends everything that the State of Israel does, who defends the settlements that are going on in the West Bank, when people are being driven off the land by the Israeli army. All of these things are justified, but anybody who in any way does something which responds to that is regarded as a terrorist and extremist and is a dangerous fanatic. And we have to reject that type of language and reject the idea that this is what it's about, because otherwise we are now in a situation where we are in a spiral. You have foreign policy which is creating terrorism, it leads to more terrorism, that leads to more foreign policy which cracks down in particular countries. And now we're told you have to intervene in countries because there are terrorists. You had to go into Afghanistan. Suddenly we find, 12 years later, they're talking to the Taliban. You wonder what the whole war was about for 12 years. But that kind of spiral cannot be broken until there is a change in British and US foreign policy. And until politicians recognise this, it will keep going on and on. And of course, it has created the racism and Islamophobia that we predicted it would create. And this is something which, you know, people have talked quite rightly about the rise of the EDL, the rise of racist and fascist parties, not just in this country, but across Europe, in countries like Hungary, in France, where the Fascist National Front has increased its support in all these places, and a lot of this is about attacks on Muslims. It isn't exclusively that, but at the heart of racist and fascist ideology in Europe today is the whole question of Islamophobia. And we have to understand that this is, if you like, the last respectable racism in Europe. It is the last, you know, they feel they can justify this by putting it in terms of extremism and so on. And there are all sorts of ways which this is done. There is now a campaign about genital mutilation, which many people find absolutely horrific. The kind of hidden agenda here is that this is about Muslims. Now, it isn't just about Muslims, it covers people of a number of different religions in a number of different countries. But the whole unspoken idea is that these are the people who are really behind it. And you find, if you go to Scandinavian countries, this is how Muslims are viewed, that they're all these kind of people who commit these sorts of things without understanding this is not what most Muslims do, and it's not what most Muslims would think is the right way to live. So it seems to me we now have Islamophobia on a huge scale, but actually the people motivating the Islamophobia are not the far right and the fascists. They're the people who are at the sharp end on the streets, but this comes from the government, it comes from the media, and it is being repeated time and time again by the government and the media, and therefore we have to link the issues together. It's absolutely right that we fight against fascism on the streets. It's absolutely right, in my opinion, that we call for no platform for all of these people. It's absolutely disgraceful, I think, that the BBC, which always puts itself, you know, paints itself in liberal colours, seems to find it okay to have long interviews with leaders of the EDL and leaders of the BNP, as they have done in the past, but not to actually have voices who oppose them and don't think they should be given a platform. These people don't get the same treatment from the BBC. But we need to understand this is an ideology which is connected. It's connected with imperialism. It's connected with the wars. It's connected with the austerity, because when you're trying to cut people's benefits and you're introducing a bedroom tax and you're doing all the other, and we had even more of this from George Osborne today. When you're trying to impose austerity, what do? You divide and rule. What do? You say it's the person down the street from you who's got a different coloured skin or who comes from a different country in the world, and those are the people that you try to scapegoat. And this government has a very deliberate policy of trying to do this, and therefore we want to fight against racism, against Islamophobia, against the war, and against austerity. We have to begin to link these issues up. And I'll just conclude by really saying this means we have to fight. And Joe, when he spoke, said about he really likes living in London because it's a very multicultural society. It's worth remembering it wasn't always like that, and it's worth remembering as well that the way in which London became multicultural was by a series of fights and campaigns and arguments and discussions, which eventually meant that people who came here as immigrants, who came here to live in the 50s and the 60s, who came here as people who were treated as second-class citizens, who couldn't get houses, where there was racist council housing. You used to be able to get council houses in those days, but you couldn't get them in many areas if you were black or Asian, because there was a colour bar against people getting them. People were stopped from having jobs in certain places. This was a campaign which went on for decades to fight against racism and fascism, to fight against those kind of discriminatory policies. And it's that, for that reason, that we now have a city like London which is so multicultural. We need to be clear that when something like Woolwich happens, and I think actually it's a credit still to the vast majority of people in London, that the response to the Woolwich incident and the way in which it was on everybody's television screens and so on wasn't a worse response in terms of racial tension and in terms of attacks. And that isn't to minimise the very large number of attacks that have been. But it's clear that most people in this country oppose those kind of attacks. We have to link these issues and we have to make it absolutely clear. If we are going to get rid of Islamophobia, if we are going to get rid of racism, at the very heart of these policies is government policy which is about bombing people, invading people in other countries, countries that we've long colonised and long occupied, and that we have to demonise those people in order to justify those wars. That's why the war and Islamophobia are so closely connected. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindsey, and thanks to all